The gunshot that rang out through the dusty streets of Dallas, Texas, that September afternoon in 1878 changed everything. Though 8-year-old Margaret Harper wouldn't understand why until much later, when she learned that sound had been her mother's way of sealing a deal with the devil himself. Margaret sat on the splintered porch of the run-down boarding house, where her mother rented a single room, her bare feet dusty and her dress patched so many times the original fabric was barely visible. She watched as men in fine suits passed by, their boots clicking against the wooden planks of the sidewalk, none of them sparing a glance for the thin child with tangled brown hair and eyes too old for her young face. Her mother, Constance Harper, had been inside the saloon across the street for hours now, and Margaret knew better than to go looking for her. The last time she had, her mother had screamed at her in front of everyone, calling her ungrateful and a burden. The sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, when Constance finally emerged from the saloon. She wasn't alone. A woman walked beside her, tall and severe-looking, dressed in black silk that seemed far too fancy for Dallas. Her face was painted with rouge and powder, but it couldn't hide the hardness in her eyes. Margaret instinctively drew her knees up to her chest as the two women approached. "There she is," Constance said, her words slurring slightly. "Pretty enough, don't you think? Clean her up and she'll fetch a good price in a few years." Margaret's stomach twisted with a fear she couldn't name. The woman in black circled her slowly, evaluating her like she might a horse at auction. "She's scrawny, needs feeding up, but yes, she has potential. The agreement stands. $200 now, another $300 when she turns 16 and starts earning." "That's my girl," Constance said, and for a moment Margaret felt a flutter of hope that her mother was refusing the deal. Then Constance added, "Always knew she'd be good for something." The transaction happened quickly after that. Money changed hands. Papers were signed inside the boarding house with the landlord as witness, and Margaret found herself sitting in the back of a wagon next to the woman in black, watching her mother walk away without a backward glance. She wanted to cry, wanted to scream, but her throat had closed up tight and all she could do was sit frozen as the wagon lurched forward. "My name is Mrs. Beatrice Thornton," the woman said as they rolled through the streets toward the edge of town. "You'll call me madam, and you'll do exactly as you're told. I run a respectable establishment, and girls who behave themselves eat regularly and have a warm place to sleep. Girls who cause trouble learn quickly that the streets of Dallas are far less forgiving than I am. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. They traveled for nearly an hour to a large house on the outskirts of Dallas, painted white but graying with age and neglect. Other girls peered out from behind curtains as they arrived, their faces ranging from curious to pitying. Margaret was taken inside, given a real bath for the first time in months, and dressed in a simple but clean cotton dress. An older girl named Sarah, perhaps 15, showed her to a small room she would share with 2 other girls. "Don't look so scared," Sarah said, though her own eyes held a weariness that belied her youth. "You're young enough that you'll just be doing chores for years yet. Washing, cooking, mending. It's the older girls who have to entertain the men who come calling. By the time you're old enough, maybe you'll have figured out how to escape this place." But escape seemed impossible to 8-year-old Margaret. She had no family who wanted her, no money, no skills beyond the basic household tasks her mother had grudgingly taught her. So she settled into the routine of Mrs. Thornton's house, scrubbing floors and washing linens, trying to make herself invisible and useful in equal measure. 3 years passed in this manner. Margaret grew taller if not much stronger, her body refusing to fill out despite regular meals. She learned quickly which of Mrs. Thornton's customers to avoid, which dark corners to hide in when men stayed late and wandered the halls drunk and looking for trouble. Sarah had run away 2 years earlier and been brought back by the sheriff himself, beaten so badly she couldn't walk for a week. After that, no one else tried to leave. On a sweltering August morning in 1881, when Margaret had just turned 11, Mrs. Thornton received word that a wealthy rancher was coming through Dallas and wanted to see what merchandise she had available. The older girls were primped and prepared, but Mrs. Thornton also insisted Margaret be cleaned up and presented. Though she swore to the girl, it was only so the rancher could see her potential for future investment. Margaret stood in line with the others in the front parlor, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her heart hammering against her ribs. The rancher was a heavy-set man with cold eyes and hands that lingered too long on bare arms and shoulders as he inspected each girl. When he reached Margaret, those hands came toward her face and she couldn't help herself. She jerked away and ran. She burst through the front door and into the street, her bare feet flying over the packed dirt road. Behind her, she heard Mrs. Thornton shrieking and the rancher laughing, and then the sound of boots pounding after her. Dallas in the middle of the day was crowded with wagons and horses, people going about their business, but no one stopped to help a fleeing child. She darted between buildings, her breath coming in gasps, her side cramping. She didn't see the horse until she ran directly into its path. The rider hauled back on the reins so hard the horse reared, hooves pawing the air inches from Margaret's head. She fell backward onto the ground, throwing her arms up to protect herself, certain she was about to be trampled. But the hooves came down to either side of her, and then a man was swinging down from the saddle, his face a mixture of concern and anger. "What in God's name are you doing, child? You could have been killed." Margaret scrambled backward like a cornered animal, too terrified to speak. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the practical clothing of a working rancher, his dark hair slightly too long beneath his worn hat. He couldn't have been more than 25 or so, with a strong jaw shadowed by a few days' stubble. His eyes, a striking dark blue, softened as he took in her terrified expression. "Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you," he said, crouching down to her level but keeping his distance. "Are you hurt? Did something happen?" Before Margaret could answer, Mrs. Thornton's man caught up, grabbing her roughly by the arm and hauling her to her feet. "Stupid girl, Mrs. Thornton is going to have your hide for this. And you," he said to the stranger, "can send any bills for your trouble to Beatrice Thornton's establishment." The blue-eyed man stood slowly and something in his expression changed. "Thornton's place. This child is from Thornton's place, property of, yes. Now if you'll excuse us." The man started to drag Margaret away. "Wait." The single word was quiet but carried such authority that Mrs. Thornton's man actually stopped. "How much? Excuse me. How much for the girl? Name your price." Mrs. Thornton's man looked confused, then calculating. "She's worth at least 500, but she's promised to another buyer who's already made a down payment. I'll give you $1,000 right now if you get Mrs. Thornton out here to sign her over to me." Margaret stared up at her potential savior, unable to process what was happening. Was this stranger really trying to buy her, or was this just another transaction that would land her somewhere worse? The man must have seen her fear because he looked down at her and said quietly, "I promise you, child, I'm not what you're afraid I am. My name is Ethan Jameson, and I'm going to get you out of here." Mrs. Thornton herself appeared within minutes, drawn by the promise of money. She tried to negotiate, to explain about the other buyer, but Ethan Jameson was immovable. He produced a thick roll of bills from his saddlebag and counted out $1,000 while half of Dallas looked on. Papers were drawn up by a lawyer who happened to be nearby, making Margaret legally the ward of one Ethan Jameson, rancher, of the Jameson Ranch some 40 miles north of Dallas. When the transaction was complete, Ethan lifted Margaret gently onto his horse and swung up behind her. She sat stiff and terrified in front of him, feeling the strength in the arms that held the reins on either side of her. He didn't try to make conversation as they rode through Dallas, but she could feel him glancing down at her every few minutes as if to reassure himself she was really there. They stopped at a general store where Ethan bought her boots, several dresses, a warm coat, and other necessities. The shopkeeper's wife, a kind-faced woman named Mrs. Patterson, took Margaret into the back room and helped her change into proper attire, clucking her tongue over the girl's thin frame and the bruises on her arms. "That Mr. Jameson is a good man, Mrs. Patterson said as she buttoned up Margaret's new dress. "Lost his wife and baby daughter to fever 3 years back. Hasn't been the same since, according to those who knew him before. Keeps to himself mostly, works his ranch with just a few hands. I don't know what moved him to take you on, child, but I suspect you're luckier than you know." When Margaret emerged, looking like a proper young lady for the first time in her life, Ethan's expression shifted to something unreadable. "You look like you could actually be 11 years old now instead of a half-starved waif," he said gruffly. "Are you hungry? There's a decent restaurant 2 doors down." Margaret nodded mutely, and they sat in the restaurant while she ate her first real meal in years under Ethan's watchful gaze. He ordered her roast beef and potatoes, bread with butter and milk, and didn't comment when she ate like someone who expected the plate to be snatched away at any moment. Finally, as she was finishing, he said, "I suppose you're wondering why I bought you out of that situation." Margaret looked up at him, her dark eyes wary. "Truth is, I saw you running and I saw that fear in your eyes and I saw my daughter. She'd be about your age now if she'd lived. Her name was Emma." His voice caught slightly on the name. "I couldn't save her, but I could save you. So that's what I did. I'm not expecting anything from you except that you live like a child ought to live. There's a woman at my ranch, Mrs. Garcia, who does the cooking and manages the house. She'll look after you, make sure you're educated proper. And in time, when you're grown, you'll be free to make your own choices about your life. Does that sound acceptable to you?" Margaret's throat was too tight to speak, so she nodded. It was the first time in her life anyone had asked if something was acceptable to her. They rode out of Dallas that afternoon, heading north into the open country. The Jameson Ranch, when they reached it near sunset, was larger and more prosperous than Margaret had imagined. The main house was a sprawling single-story structure built of good timber with a wide porch wrapping around it. There were several outbuildings, corrals full of horses, and in the distance, she could see cattle grazing in the golden light. Mrs. Rosa Garcia turned out to be a warm, maternal woman in her 50s who took one look at Margaret and immediately swept her into a crushing hug. "Ay, pobrecita, so thin. Come, you need feeding up." She shot Ethan a look that was part gratitude and part exasperation. "You bring home this child without warning, Ethan. Lucky I always cook extra." It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, Ethan admitted, and something in his tone made Mrs. Garcia's expression soften. "Emma would have been proud of you," she said quietly. That night, Margaret slept in a real bed in a room of her own for the first time in her life. She lay awake for hours, waiting for the catch, for the moment when this dream would reveal itself to be a nightmare. But the only sounds were the peaceful noises of her ranch settling down for the night, and eventually, exhausted, she fell into a deep sleep. The days that followed established a new rhythm. Mrs. Garcia woke Margaret each morning with breakfast, then spent hours teaching her to read and write properly, something she'd only learned the basics of before. In the afternoons, Margaret helped with household chores, but these were different from the backbreaking labor at Mrs. Thornton's. Here, she was taught skills, praised for her efforts, and given time to rest. Ethan was often out working the ranch, but in the evenings he would return, and they would all eat dinner together like a real family. Margaret watched Ethan carefully during those early weeks, trying to understand him. He was quiet and sometimes melancholy, often staring into the distance as if seeing something no one else could. But he was unfailingly kind to her, asking about her lessons, bringing her small gifts from town, teaching her to ride a gentle mare named Buttercup. Slowly, carefully, Margaret began to trust him. Months passed, then a year. Margaret's 12th birthday came and went, marked by a cake Mrs. Garcia baked and a beautiful leather-bound journal from Ethan for her to practice her writing. She was growing stronger, her frame filling out with regular meals, her face losing that haunted look. She laughed more, talked more, began to feel like maybe she was allowed to be a child after all. It was during her 13th summer, in 1883, that things began to shift in ways Margaret didn't fully understand at the time. Ethan hired a new ranch hand named Miguel, Mrs. Garcia's nephew, who was close to Margaret's age. They became fast friends, and Margaret found herself spending her free time following Miguel around the ranch, learning about cattle and horses and the hard work that went into running a successful operation. Ethan watched these developments with mixed feelings that showed occasionally on his face. One evening, as Margaret was excitedly telling him about a calf she'd helped Miguel deliver that day, he suddenly said, "You're growing up fast, Margaret. Sometimes I look at you and can barely remember that frightened little girl who ran into my horse. Is that bad?" Margaret asked, suddenly worried. "No," Ethan said softly. "It's good. It's what should happen. You should grow up safe and happy and whole. It's just that time moves faster than we expect, and before you know it, everything has changed." Margaret didn't understand the sadness in his voice, but she filed the moment away in her memory. The following year brought changes to the ranch. One of Ethan's longtime hands decided to retire, and Ethan began taking a more active role in training Margaret in the business side of ranching. She had a quick mind for numbers and a natural way with the animals, and she found herself loving the work. At 14, she could ride as well as most of the hands, help with roundups, and manage the account books when Ethan was away on business. It was also the year she began to truly see Ethan not just as her rescuer and guardian, but as a man. He was 30 years old now, still handsome despite the lines that grief and hard work had carved into his face. She noticed the strength in his hands when he showed her how to rope, the kindness in his eyes when he thought no one was watching, the way he still mourned his lost family, even as he built a new life. But Margaret was only 14, and these observations were innocent, more about growing awareness of the world around her than anything else. She focused on her studies, her work, and her friendship with Miguel, who had become like a brother to her. The summer Margaret turned 15 in 1885, a woman named Constance Harper appeared at the ranch. Margaret was in the barn helping Miguel repair a saddle when Mrs. Garcia rushed in, her face pale. "Margaret, your mother is here. She's with Ethan at the house." The tools fell from Margaret's hands. "What? No, she sold me. She has no right to be here." "I know, Mija, but she's here and she's demanding to see you. Ethan is trying to handle it, but I think you should come." Margaret's legs felt weak as she walked to the house, Miguel a solid presence at her side. Through the window, she could see a woman she barely recognized. Constance had aged poorly, her face haggard and her clothes shabby. She was shouting at Ethan, who stood with his arms crossed and his expression harder than Margaret had ever seen it. "I have every right to see my daughter. That's what she is, blood of my blood, and you had no right to take her from her mother." "I have every legal right," Ethan said coldly. "I have the papers to prove it, signed by you selling her to Mrs. Thornton, and signed by Mrs. Thornton selling her guardianship to me. You gave up your rights as a mother when you sold your daughter to a brothel. I was desperate. I had no money, no way to care for her. I did what I had to do. You did what was easiest, and now Margaret has a real home, a real life, and you're not going to take that from her." The front door opened and Margaret stepped through, her chin lifted in defiance even though her heart was racing. Constance turned and her eyes widened. "Margaret, is that you? Look at you, all grown and fine. I knew you'd be pretty one day. What do you want?" Margaret's voice was steady despite her fear. "I want to make amends, baby. I want us to be a family again. I've changed. I've gotten myself together. I have a little shop in Dallas now selling dresses. I can take care of you properly now." "No." The word hung in the air between them. Constance's expression shifted from wheedling to angry. "I'm your mother. You don't get to tell me no." "Actually, she does," Ethan said. "Margaret is my legal ward until she turns 18. Even after that, she's free to make her own choices. And it's clear she's made hers." Constance's eyes narrowed as she looked between them. "I see what this is. He's got you convinced you owe him something, but mark my words, girl, men like him don't do things out of kindness. He'll expect payment eventually, and you'll wish you'd come with me when you had the chance." Margaret felt something hot and protective flare in her chest. "Ethan Jameson is a better person than you could ever understand. He saved me when no one else cared, and he's never asked me for anything except to be safe and happy. You're the one who sold me. You're the one who gave up any right to call yourself my mother. Now please leave." Constance opened her mouth to argue, but Ethan stepped forward. "You heard her. Get off my property. If you come back, I'll have the sheriff escort you away in chains." They watched as Constance climbed back into her wagon and drove away, her back rigid with anger. When she was out of sight, Margaret found herself shaking. Ethan's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder. "You did well," he said quietly. "I'm proud of you." Margaret turned, and for the first time since that day 4 years ago when he'd bought her freedom, she threw her arms around him and held on tight. After a moment's hesitation, Ethan hugged her back, and she felt safe again. The incident with Constance changed something in Margaret. She became even more determined to prove herself worthy of the chance Ethan had given her. She threw herself into working the ranch, learning everything she could, making herself indispensable. She was 15 now, technically old enough to be courted according to the standards of the time, and Mrs. Garcia occasionally hinted that Miguel had developed feelings for her, but Margaret wasn't interested. Miguel was like family, and besides, her thoughts kept drifting to Ethan in ways she didn't quite understand yet. That winter was harsh, with ice storms that killed several head of cattle and damaged one of the barns. Margaret worked alongside the men to save what they could, her hands raw and her body exhausted by the end of each day. Ethan worked harder than anyone, driving himself relentlessly, and Margaret worried about him in a way that felt different from simple gratitude or familial affection. One night, when a particularly bad storm had trapped them all in the main house, Margaret found Ethan standing alone on the porch, staring out at the ice-covered landscape. She brought him coffee and stood beside him, not speaking, just offering her presence. "I keep thinking about Emma," Ethan said finally. "She'd have been 13 now, would have loved this ranch, I think. She was fearless, even as a baby." "I'm sorry I'm not her," Margaret said softly. "I know I can never replace what you lost." Ethan turned to her, his expression startled. "Is that what you think? Margaret, you're not a replacement for anything. You're your own person, and you've become someone I'm honored to know. You've brought life back to this house in a way I never expected. I'm the one who should be grateful." Something in his words and in the way he looked at her made Margaret's heart skip. She was suddenly very aware of how close they were standing, of the warmth radiating from his body despite the cold air. But she was only 15, and Ethan would never see her as anything but the child he'd rescued, so she swallowed her confusing feelings and smiled. "We're lucky to have each other then," she said lightly, and the moment passed. The next 2 years were perhaps the happiest of Margaret's life. The ranch prospered, and Margaret grew into a young woman of 17 with a quick mind, a kind heart, and a strength that came from surviving the worst life could offer and coming out the other side. She was beautiful too, though she barely noticed, with thick brown hair that caught golden highlights in the sun and eyes that had regained their ability to trust and hope. Ethan watched her grow with feelings he tried desperately to suppress. She was his ward, his responsibility, the child he'd saved. He had no right to think of her in any other way. But she was also no longer a child, and he couldn't help but notice the woman she'd become. She was intelligent and capable, running much of the ranch's day-to-day operations now. She was compassionate, always first to help when someone was sick or in trouble. She made him laugh in a way no one had since his wife died. And she looked at him sometimes with an expression in her eyes that made his heart race and his conscience scream in equal measure. He tried to distract himself by focusing on work, by taking trips to Dallas alone, by maintaining a careful distance. But it was impossible when they lived on the same ranch and worked side by side every day. By the time Margaret turned 17 in the fall of 1887, Ethan was forced to admit to himself that he had fallen in love with his ward, and the guilt of it nearly consumed him. Margaret knew something was wrong. Ethan had become distant, sometimes almost cold. He avoided being alone with her, spoke to her only about ranch business, and seemed to be looking for reasons to be away from the house. She worried that she'd done something wrong, that he regretted taking her in, that he was preparing to send her away. The thought terrified her because somewhere along the way, she had fallen completely in love with Ethan Jameson. It was Mrs. Garcia who finally intervened. She cornered Ethan in his study one evening in January of 1888, just a few months before Margaret's 18th birthday, and closed the door behind her with a decisive click. "We need to talk about Margaret," she announced. Ethan looked up from his papers, his expression guarded. "Is something wrong?" "Yes, something is very wrong. That poor girl thinks you're about to send her away. She's been crying herself to sleep because you've been treating her like a stranger for months now." Guilt stabbed through Ethan. "I'm not sending her away. I would never do that." "Then what is going on? You saved that child, Ethan. You gave her a home and a family. You've watched her grow into a fine young woman, and now you're pushing her away for no reason she can understand." "There's a reason," Ethan said heavily. "One I'm deeply ashamed of, Mrs." Garcia studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "You're in love with her." Ethan's head snapped up. "How did you?" "I have eyes, Ethan, and I'm not blind to how Margaret looks at you either. She's in love with you too, though she's probably terrified to admit it. Which is exactly why I've been keeping my distance. Rosa, I took her in when she was 11 years old. I was supposed to protect her, give her a chance at a normal life. Falling in love with her is a betrayal of everything I promised. Or, Mrs. Garcia said gently, it's proof that you're both human. Ethan, you didn't raise Margaret from infancy. You saved her from hell and gave her a home, yes, but your relationship has always been more like partners running a ranch than father and daughter. She's about to turn 18. She's a grown woman with her own mind and her own heart. Don't you think she deserves to know the truth? She deserves better than a man who's 12 years older and haunted by ghosts. She deserves to make her own choices. Talk to her. Be honest. Let her decide what she wants. But Ethan couldn't. The guilt and shame were too great. Instead, he doubled down on his distance, and Margaret's misery grew. It came to a head on a bright March morning when Margaret announced at breakfast that she'd been thinking about taking a position as a teacher in Dallas. Mrs. Patterson mentioned in her last letter that they're looking for someone to teach at the new schoolhouse. I'm educated enough now, thanks to you and Mrs. Garcia. Maybe it's time I made my own way in the world. The statement was a test, a desperate attempt to get some reaction from Ethan, to understand if he cared at all about her leaving. And it worked. Ethan's coffee cup hit the table hard enough to crack. Absolutely not. Margaret's heart leapt even as her temper flared. Why not? You've been making it clear you don't want me here anymore. I thought you'd be relieved. Relieved, Margaret, Ethan stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need to check the south fence. He strode out of the house without another word. Margaret followed him. She'd spent enough years being afraid, being passive, letting others decide her fate. She was done with that. She caught up to him at the barn where he was saddling his horse with sharp, angry movements. Talk to me, she demanded. Tell me what I did wrong. Tell me why you can't stand to be around me anymore. I deserve at least that much. You didn't do anything wrong, Ethan said without looking at her. This is about me, not you. Then help me understand. Ethan, you saved my life. You gave me everything. You're the most important person in my world, and I can't bear this distance between us. If you want me to leave, just say so and I will. But I need to know why. Ethan spun to face her, and the anguish in his eyes took her breath away. I want you to leave because I can't trust myself around you anymore. Because every day I have to fight the urge to touch you, to tell you how beautiful you are, to ask you to stay forever, not as my ward but as my wife. Because I'm in love with you, Margaret, and it's wrong and it's shameful and I hate myself for it. The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt like the world had tilted on its axis. You love me. I'm sorry, Ethan said hoarsely. I know it's wrong. You were just a child when I brought you here, and I was supposed to protect you, not develop feelings that are completely inappropriate. I've tried to stop, tried to push you away so you could have a normal life with someone your own age. But you asked for the truth, so there it is. Margaret stepped closer to him, her heart hammering. Ethan, look at me. Reluctantly, he met her eyes. I love you too, she said clearly. I've loved you for years now, maybe from the moment you stood up to Mrs. Thornton for me. You're not just the man who saved me. You're the man who believed in me, who taught me to be strong, who made me feel valued and safe and seen. You're the man I want to spend my life with. You're 17, Ethan said desperately. You don't know what you want yet. I'm almost 18 and I know exactly what I want. I want you. I want this ranch and this life and the family we could build together. I want to wake up beside you every morning and fall asleep in your arms every night. I want to have your children and grow old with you. And unless you tell me right now that you don't want the same thing, I'm not going anywhere. Ethan stared at her, his defenses crumbling. What will people say? A man my age marrying his ward. I don't care what people say. Do you? And there it was, the truth laid bare between them. Ethan reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and cupped her face in his hands. Are you absolutely certain? Because if we do this, there's no going back. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Ethan kissed her then, softly at first and then with all the pent-up longing of the past years. Margaret melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, feeling like she'd finally come home in the truest sense of the word. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "We'll wait until you turn 18, he said firmly. "We'll do this properly. I'll court you and then we'll get married with everyone's blessing. I won't have anyone thinking I took advantage of you." Margaret laughed, giddy with happiness. "Whatever you say. As long as I get to marry you in the end, I'll wait as long as you need." The next 2 months were a revelation. Ethan courted Margaret with old-fashioned formality, bringing her flowers, taking her on picnics, spending evenings on the porch swing talking about everything and nothing. They held hands, stole kisses when Mrs. Garcia wasn't looking, and planned their future together. The ranch hands figured out what was happening and reacted with general approval, Miguel going so far as to tell Ethan that if he hurt Margaret, he'd have to answer to him, which made Ethan laugh. On Margaret's 18th birthday in May of 1888, Ethan proposed properly with his grandmother's ring, in front of Mrs. Garcia and all the ranch hands. Margaret said yes through happy tears, and they set their wedding date for June. The wedding was small but perfect, held at the ranch with a traveling preacher officiating and most of Dallas in attendance. Margaret wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Garcia had helped her sew, and Ethan wore his best suit and looked at his bride like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever uttered. When they exchanged vows, promising to love and honor each other for the rest of their lives, there wasn't a dry eye in attendance. Their wedding night was tender and loving, both of them nervous but eager. Ethan was gentle with Margaret, taking his time, making sure she felt safe and cherished. And when they finally came together as husband and wife, it felt like the final piece of Margaret's broken life had clicked into place. She was home. She was loved. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The years that followed were full and happy. Margaret and Ethan ran the ranch together as true partners, their mutual respect and love deepening with each passing season. In the spring of 1889, Margaret gave birth to their first child, a healthy boy with Ethan's blue eyes and Margaret's dark hair. They named him Samuel, and Ethan cried when he held his son for the first time, overwhelmed by the second chance life had given him. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Rose after Ethan's mother. Then another son, Benjamin, in 1893. The ranch house that had been so quiet for so long was filled with the sounds of children laughing and playing, with the warmth of a real family. Margaret proved to be a wonderful mother, patient and loving but firm when needed, determined that her children would always know they were wanted and valued. In 1895, when Margaret was 25 and Ethan 37, they stood together on the porch one evening watching their 3 children play in the yard. Samuel, now 6, was teaching Rose how to rope a fence post while Benjamin toddled around trying to keep up with his older siblings. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been?" Margaret asked, leaning into Ethan's side. "If you hadn't been riding through Dallas that day, if you hadn't stopped." Ethan wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her close. "I think about it sometimes. And then I thank God that I was exactly where I needed to be at exactly the right moment. You've given me everything, Margaret. A reason to live again, children I never thought I'd have, a love I didn't believe I deserved. You've given me everything too," Margaret said softly. "A real family. A home. The knowledge that I matter, that I'm loved for who I am. You showed me that my mother selling me wasn't the end of my story. It was just the painful middle part that led me to you." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. From inside the house, they could hear Mrs. Garcia singing as she prepared dinner, her voice slightly off-key but full of joy. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and beautiful, a testament to years of hard work and dedication. "Mama, Papa, come see." Rose called out, having successfully roped the fence post on her first try. Margaret and Ethan walked down to admire their daughter's achievement, each taking a child's hand, forming a circle of family that was whole and unbroken. That night, after the children were tucked into bed and Mrs. Garcia had retired to her cottage, Margaret and Ethan sat together in their bedroom. Ethan brushed out Margaret's long hair, a nightly ritual they'd developed over the years, his touch gentle and reverent. "I love you," he said, as he did every night, "more than I can ever express with words." "I love you too," Margaret replied, turning to face him. "Thank you for seeing me that day, not just for buying my freedom, but for really seeing me, for believing I was worth saving." "You were always worth saving," Ethan said, pulling her into his arms. "You just needed someone to recognize it. And I'm so grateful that someone got to be me." They made love that night with the ease and passion of two people who knew each other's bodies and hearts completely. And afterward, lying tangled together in the darkness, Margaret reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From that terrified 8-year-old girl being sold by her mother to this confident, loved woman lying in the arms of her husband, surrounded by the family they'd built together. She had been sold as property, treated as merchandise, seen as worthless by the woman who should have loved her most. But destiny, or God, or simple chance had placed her in the path of a man with a broken heart and room for one more person to love. And that chance meeting had blossomed into something neither of them could have predicted, a love story that healed them both and created a legacy that would last for generations. The Jameson ranch continued to thrive over the years. Samuel grew up to be a fine rancher like his father, eventually marrying a sweet-natured girl from Dallas and giving Margaret and Ethan their first grandchildren. Rose became a teacher, fulfilling the path Margaret had once considered for herself, and used her position to help other children who came from difficult circumstances. Benjamin, the youngest, developed a talent for horse breeding and expanded that part of the ranch's business until Jameson horses were sought after throughout Texas. Margaret and Ethan grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing down, but their love never wavering. They celebrated 50 years of marriage in 1938, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all living proof that something beautiful could grow from the darkest of beginnings. When Ethan died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Margaret grieved deeply, but with gratitude for the incredible life they'd shared. She lived another 5 years, spending her time telling her grandchildren stories about the Wild West they'd never known, about a time when a desperate girl ran into the path of a grieving man's horse and changed both their lives forever. On her deathbed, surrounded by family, Margaret's last words were simple. "I was lost and he found me. I was sold but he set me free. I was alone but he gave me a family. Tell them to remember that love can heal anything, even the deepest wounds. Tell them to always look for the lost children and be the ones who save them." Margaret Harper Jameson died at age 73, beloved by everyone who knew her, leaving behind a legacy of love, compassion, and second chances. She was buried next to Ethan on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, their graves marked with simple stones that read, "Here lie Ethan and Margaret Jameson. They saved each other." And in the years that followed, the Jameson family never forgot the story of how their family began. With an act of cruelty that led to an act of kindness, with a transaction that became a transformation, with a child who was sold but found her way home anyway. They taught their children that family isn't always about blood, that love can heal the deepest scars, and that sometimes the worst moments in life are simply the darkness before the dawn. Their story became legend in Dallas, passed down through generations as a reminder that the darkest circumstances can lead to the brightest futures. People spoke of the girl who was sold but found a true family anyway, of the man who channeled his grief into saving a life, of the love that grew from the most unlikely of beginnings. And every time the story was told, it ended the same way, with Margaret and Ethan watching the sunset together from their porch, surrounded by the family they'd built, proof that destiny sometimes knows better than we do where we truly belong. The final chapter of their story was written not in their deaths, but in the lives they touched, the children they saved beyond just themselves. Inspired by their own story, the Jameson family began a tradition of taking in orphaned and troubled children, giving them homes and chances just as Margaret had been given. Over the decades, dozens of children found their way to the Jameson ranch, each one welcomed with open arms and given the opportunity to heal and grow and thrive. Some of these children stayed and became part of the ranching operation. Others went on to different lives, becoming teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, parents. But all of them carried with them the lesson that Margaret and Ethan had learned and then taught, that being sold, abandoned, or rejected doesn't define your worth. That true family is built not just through blood but through love, commitment, and choice. That the arms meant to hold you will find you eventually, no matter how long and winding the path. And so the story that began with a gunshot in Dallas in 1878, with a desperate woman selling her daughter to survive, transformed into something beautiful and lasting. Margaret Harper, who had every reason to become bitter and broken, instead became a beacon of hope and healing. Ethan Jameson, who had locked his heart away after tragedy, learned to love again, and in doing so created a legacy that would outlive them both by generations. Their love story wasn't conventional. It didn't start with a dance at a social or a chance meeting at church. It started with a rescue, grew through patience and trust, and blossomed into something that defied the judgments and expectations of society. But it was real, and it was powerful, and it changed everything not just for them but for everyone their lives touched. In the end, that's what destiny is. Not some predetermined path laid out before us, but the moments when the universe conspires to put the right people in the right place at the right time, giving them the chance to choose love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation. Margaret chose to trust Ethan when she had every reason not to trust anyone. Ethan chose to love Margaret when he could have stayed locked in grief forever. And those choices, made bravely in the face of past pain and future uncertainty, created a story worth telling, a love worth celebrating, and a family that would endure for generations. The Jameson Ranch still operates today, over 100 years later, run by the great-great-grandchildren of Margaret and Ethan. And on the wall of the main house, preserved under glass, hangs the original bill of sale from 1881, the document that transferred ownership of 11-year-old Margaret Harper from Beatrice Thornton to Ethan Jameson for the sum of $1,000. Below it, in Margaret's own handwriting, is a note she wrote in her 70s. This paper once represented my enslavement, but my husband transformed it into proof of my freedom. May it remind everyone who sees it that our lowest moments can become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. With love always, Margaret Harper Jameson. And that, truly, is where the story ends and the legacy begins, with the understanding that being placed in the arms of true family isn't always a gentle process. Sometimes it starts with being sold, with running scared, with nearly being trampled by a horse in the middle of a dusty street. But however rough the beginning, when you finally arrive where you're meant to be, in the arms of those who truly love you, all the pain of the journey becomes worth it. That's what Margaret learned. That's what Ethan taught her. And that's what they gave to everyone who came after them. The knowledge that home isn't where you start, but where you're brave enough to let yourself belong.